Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that it never even crossed your mind that they were quietly rewriting your place in their life? I used to believe that grief softened people, that losing someone created a kind of invisible thread pulling the family closer, reminding us of what mattered. But the morning I stood in the middle of Nashville International Airport, I realized grief doesn't always bring people together. Sometimes it shows you exactly who never cared to begin with. It started like a blessing, a gentle suggestion my son made weeks after my husband's funeral. "Mom, come with us. It'll be good for you." Those words felt like a warm hand on my back, guiding me toward daylight. After losing Jake, I clung to any sign of affection, any hint that I wasn't drifting alone in the storm. So when they talked about a family trip, a healing trip, a getaway to breathe again, I didn't question it. I didn't question why Tanya, my daughter-in-law, smiled too tightly when she mentioned it, or why my son avoided looking directly at me when I asked about the details. I didn't question why I never saw the receipts, why the itinerary seemed incomplete, why my suitcase felt strangely lighter than I remembered packing. Because when you're desperate to belong, you don't look at the shadows. You focus on the light you hope is still left. But hope can be a dangerous filter. It hides the cracks until your whole world is falling through them. That morning, the airport gleamed with polished floors and loud echoes, families rolling luggage, children chasing each other near the big windows where the planes rested like giants. I walked beside my son and Tanya, trying to match their pace, trying not to feel like the odd piece in their picture-perfect frame. I even thanked them more times than dignity should allow, for including me, for thinking of me, for helping me get out of the house. And each time I thanked them, Tanya's lips curled into a smile, but not the kind that reaches the eyes, the kind that hides something behind it. Hook, a part of me noticed, but the louder part wanted to believe. Hope blinded me. The first sign something was wrong came when Tanya insisted on checking in all the luggage together. "Just hand me your bag, Blake," she said, using my name instead of Mom, which should have been a warning in itself. "We'll handle it." I hesitated for a second. I don't know why, maybe instinct. But I handed it over, just like I had handed over trust, boundaries, savings, and pieces of myself across the years without realizing the cost. Then came the second sign, the boarding passes. They tucked them into passport sleeves, slid them into expensive bags. "Mine?" Tanya said she had it with the family documents. When I asked if I could see it, she placed a manicured hand on my shoulder and said, "Relax, we've got everything sorted. Hook, I should have felt the imbalance right then." But grief fogs the mind. You don't notice the red flags. You only notice how badly you want everything to be fine. At the check-in counter, the airport agent frowned at the computer screen in that gentle but worried way customer service people have when they're about to say something you won't like. "Mum," she said, "your reservation isn't matching the return itinerary." I laughed softly, thinking it was a mistake, a glitch, something easily fixed. "I'm with my son's family," I said, pointing toward them. "We're all traveling together." She typed again. Her frown deepened. "I'm sorry," she said, lowering her voice as if secrets softened pain. "Your return ticket isn't listed. This is showing as a one-way flight." The floor didn't fall from beneath me. It tilted, slowly, the way a ship turns before sinking. "A one-way?" I repeated. Before I could ask anything else, I saw Tanya's head turn. Her eyebrows lifted like she'd been expecting this moment. She didn't rush over. She didn't look surprised. She walked toward me with the calmness of someone approaching a vending machine, not a woman facing the mother of her husband. "Mum," she said, voice smooth as glass, "we only bought you a one-way ticket. You'll figure out the return later. You needed time away, remember?" "Hook!" That's when my heartbeat changed rhythm. Slow, heavy thuds, not from sadness, but from recognition. Recognition of deceit, recognition of betrayal. Recognition that every kind gesture these past weeks wasn't kindness. It was strategy. My son didn't defend me. He didn't say, "No, Mom, it's a misunderstanding." He didn't look ashamed. He didn't even look at me. He just adjusted his sunglasses and mumbled, "It made sense this way, Mom. You've got time. You can stay a few more days." A few more days, with no money, no return ticket, no suitcase, no plan. No respect. For a moment, the sounds of the airport faded into a muffled blur, the rolling wheels, the announcements, the chatter of excited families. None of it felt real. What felt real was the sharp sting deep in my chest, the kind that comes not from a wound, but from awakening. Tanya checked her watch. "We need to go," she said. "Our boarding group is almost up." And just like that, like tossing away a grocery receipt, they walked away. No hug, no apology, no guilt, no love. Just two figures disappearing into a line, moving farther and farther from the woman who had held them, fed them, sacrificed for them, and believed in them even when they didn't deserve it. I stood there, clutching a useless itinerary, the edges crumpled beneath my tightening fingers, my throat burning with 1,000 unspoken questions. When did I stop being family? When did I become disposable? When did love turn into labor? But grief does something miraculous. It may break your heart, but it sharpens your clarity. As they vanished into the tunnel leading towards security, something inside me didn't break. It ignited. A slow, steady fire. A voice I hadn't heard in months, maybe years, rose inside me. No more. And as their silhouettes disappeared into the bright airport lights, I realized this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs, and they had no idea what I was about to do next. I didn't sit down right away. For a long moment, I just stood there in the middle of the terminal, surrounded by rushing families, rolling suitcases, loudspeaker announcements, and strangers with places to be. It was strange how the world didn't pause for me. How life kept spinning, while I stood frozen at the center of it, feeling like my entire chest had been scooped out. There are betrayals that happen suddenly. An argument, a slammed door, a harsh word. And then there are betrayals that creep in quietly over months, disguised as concern, disguised as love, disguised as family. And when the disguise finally falls, the truth hits you like cold water thrown across your face. My son didn't look back once, not even over his shoulder, not even a flicker of hesitation. A woman pushing a stroller swerved around me, smiling apologetically as she passed. That small kindness cracked something inside me, because she acknowledged my presence more than my own blood had. Hook, I felt invisible where I mattered and noticeable only to strangers. I forced myself to move, step by heavy step, until I reached a hard metal bench near the wall. My legs trembled as I lowered myself onto it. I wrapped my arms around my purse like it was the last piece of my life I still controlled, because in that moment it was. With the noise of the terminal echoing above me, I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, not from confusion, but from the suffocating realization that I had spent my whole life giving and giving and giving and giving to people who saw me not as a mother, but as a convenience. Hook, when did I become a burden in their eyes? When did I stop being someone they loved and turn into someone they merely tolerated? The airport speakers announced another flight, boarding families rushing, children squealing with excitement. A young couple kissed before separating at the security line. A group of teenagers took selfies. Everywhere I turned, I saw love, connection, belonging. And I had none of it. Not from the people who should have provided it the most. The grief from losing Jake was still raw, still open, still tender. Some days, I woke up reaching toward his side of the bed before remembering the truth. Some nights, I cried into his pillow, hoping his scent would still be there. And my son knew this. Tanya knew this. They knew how fragile I was. They knew how desperately I was trying to hold myself together. And still, they chose to abandon me, intentionally, deliberately, strategically. They didn't forget me. They planned around me. Hook, the cruelty wasn't in what they said. It was in how easily they walked away afterward. I stared at the terminal doors, half expecting, half praying, to see Mark running back toward me, but the doors remained shut. No one came, no one would. Tears stung behind my eyes, but I forced them back. Crying in public would only make me feel smaller, weaker, more broken than they already believed I was. I inhaled slowly, deeply, fighting for composure. That's when I felt a deeper pain, a memory rising like an old bruise being pressed too hard. I was 9 years old again, sitting on the curb with a tiny suitcase, waiting for a father who promised he'd pick me up after his quick trip into town. He never came. I waited until the street lights flickered on. And now, decades later, here I was again, waiting for a man who wouldn't return. Hook, how does life find its way back to the same wounds you thought you'd healed? I leaned back against the cold wall and closed my eyes. The truth tasted metallic in my mouth. I raised the very person who abandoned me. I had taught Mark to walk, speak, to tie his shoes, to be kind, to be responsible, and yet, somewhere along the way, he had learned something else instead, how to use me without guilt. I pulled my purse into my lap and fumbled with the zipper. My instinct was to call someone. But who? My sister had passed away years ago. Most of my friends had families of their own, their grown children visiting for the weekend, their grandkids calling them Nana, their houses full of noise and warmth. I didn't want to show up in their lives like a burden dropped at their doorstep. I refused to let my humiliation become theirs. No, calling family would break me even more. Begging would break me completely. Instead, I searched for something else, a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't helpless. My fingers brushed against a thin envelope inside my purse, a plain, unremarkable envelope I had forgotten I even carried with me. Inside it was the business card of my husband's old lawyer. Jake had told me once, "Keep this, just in case life ever gets louder than your strength." At the time, I laughed. Life had always been loud, but Jake had always been there to quiet it. Now he was gone, and life felt deafening. I stared at that card for a long moment, my heart thudding with something unfamiliar. Was it anger, strength, resolve? Maybe a mix of all three. Hook, what if the people who abandoned me didn't realize they left me with something more powerful than a suitcase? My own voice. My own choices. My own freedom. I stood up from the bench and walked toward the exit. Not toward the gate, not toward the security line where they vanished without remorse, but toward the sunlight spilling through the glass doors. The air outside was brisk against my face, clearing my headache, sharpening my vision. I flagged down a cab, clutching the envelope so tightly it left creases in the paper. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. My answer surprised even me. My voice was steady, calm, almost cold. "Take me to the law offices on Jefferson Street." As the car pulled away from the airport, I looked back one last time. Not to mourn, but to remember. That was the place where they walked away from me. That was the place where my old life ended. But endings aren't always tragedies. Sometimes they're doorways. Because the moment I stepped into that cab, I realized something they never expected. I wasn't stranded. I was finally free to choose what happened next. What if the lifeline that saves you isn't a person, but a decision you were always too afraid to make? The cab smelled faintly of pine air freshener and old vinyl, the kind that cracks softly when you shift your weight. As we pulled away from the airport curb, I felt something in my chest loosen. Not relief, not exactly, but the first breath I'd taken in hours that didn't feel like it had to fight through grief just to escape. The airport grew smaller in the rearview mirror, and with every passing second, so did the part of me still begging for an explanation from people who didn't think I deserved one. I stared out the window as familiar Tennessee streets blurred into view-strip malls I'd visited for decades, diners Jake and I used to stop at after long drives, the worn-down laundromat where my son once waited for me after football practice. So many memories stitched into this town, and yet I felt like a stranger passing through a place that no longer knew my name. Hook, Isn't it strange how an entire life can sit quietly in the background, offering you comfort only when you've run out of people to rely on? I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope again. It looked so small, so unimportant on the surface. Just a square piece of paper with edges softened over time. But inside it lay something powerful, Jake's handwriting, his steady pen strokes on the back of the lawyer's card. In case you ever need help, Blake, real help, don't hesitate. I had read those words once years ago, brushed them off, tucked the card away like a keepsake meant for a future that felt so distant it might never come. But today, sitting in the back of that cab with humiliation still burning hot under my ribs, those words felt like an anchor proof that someone, somewhere, had once believed I would need protection. Someone who loved me enough to plan for the day he wouldn't be here to stand between me and pain. Hook, how do you grieve a man who prepared you for heartbreak he hoped you'd never face? I rubbed my thumb across the embossed lettering, Monroe and Wade Law Offices. The cab driver glanced at me through the mirror. You okay, Mom? I wasn't, but I also wasn't broken, not completely. I will be, I said quietly, surprising myself with the certainty in my own voice. I shifted my purse onto my lap and opened the smaller inner pocket, the one I rarely used. Inside was the emergency stash Jake and I had saved over the years. We called it our break glass in case of fire fund. Ironically, it had become exactly that. And now, with my son abandoning me without a penny, this envelope felt less like backup money and more like a final love letter from a man who wanted me to survive more than he wanted anything else. The cab slowed as we approached Jefferson Street, a row of aging brick buildings with peeling paint and narrow windows. The law office was just as I remembered from years ago, humble, quiet, a place where people went to sort out the pieces of their lives without judgment or noise. My heart thudded slowly as the car stopped. The driver looked back again, as if sensing the crossroads I was standing at, even if he didn't know the story behind it. You sure this is the place? He asked. I nodded. Yes, I whispered. This is exactly where I need to be. Stepping out of the cab felt like stepping out of my old life. My knees trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I walked toward the glass door, my reflection staring back at me, tired eyes, wrinkled sweater, hair slightly out of place, but underneath all that, a woman who had been pushed to the edge and discovered a strength she didn't know she still possessed. Hook, sometimes life doesn't ask if you're ready, it just shows you who you must become. Inside, the office smelled like old books and lemon polish. I waited only a moment before the receptionist led me back. And when I saw JR the lawyer, who had helped Jake and me draft our first will, I felt something inside me settle. He stood slowly, his face softening into recognition. Blake, he said, voice gentle, it's been a long time. It had, too long. I need to change my will, I said, skipping greetings, skipping pleasantries, skipping anything that might weaken the resolve simmering in me. He didn't ask why not then. Maybe he saw the exhaustion in my shoulders, the tight way I gripped my purse, the quiet storm in my eyes. Maybe he knew that no woman walks in with a voice like mine unless something inside her has snapped clean in two. He gestured to the chair. I sat. And as he opened a fresh folder and clicked his pen, I felt something I hadn't felt since Jake died. Agency. Not anger. Not vengeance, agency. The power to decide, the power to protect myself, the power to control what came next. Hook, because sometimes the most dangerous person is the one who finally understands she deserves better. I want to remove Mark and Tanya from everything, I said clearly. The words were heavy, but not painful, not the way I expected. They felt like truth settling into place. JR studied me for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said, we'll start there. And that's how it began. Not with shouting, not with confrontation, not with tears, with a pen. With a woman who had been pushed too far. With a single choice that would change everything. By the time I signed the preliminary paperwork, a strange sense of calm spread through me. Not happiness, not yet, but relief. Relief that I wasn't powerless. Relief that they hadn't taken everything from me. Relief that the story wasn't ending at an airport bench with my heart shattered at my feet. Because, as I walked out of that office, the truth hit me harder than any betrayal ever had. I wasn't the abandoned mother. I was the woman rewriting the ending they never expected. Have you ever held a pen and realized it wasn't just ink on paper, but the quiet strike of a match that could burn down everything that once hurt you? The next morning, I returned to the law office with a steadiness I didn't recognize in myself. It felt almost foreign, like someone had stitched steel into my spine while I slept. The receptionist smiled as if she could sense the shift, and when JR waved me into his office, I walked with a certainty I had not felt since before Jake's heart stopped beating in our hallway. The folder he placed in front of me wasn't large. It didn't contain photos or painful memories. It held something much simpler: lines, signatures, legal phrases, instructions. Yet somehow, those thin pages felt heavier than the grief I had carried for months. These weren't just documents. They were decisions I had never allowed myself to consider. Decisions Jake and I once assumed would never need revising because we trusted our son more than we trusted the world. Sitting there, I realized we had been wrong. Trust without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. And I was done surrendering. Hook, sometimes a betrayal doesn't break you, it wakes you up. JR read through each section slowly, respectfully, making sure I understood every change. Remove my son as beneficiary, remove Tanya as contingent, remove access to accounts, property, assets. Remove every legal thread that tied them to the life I built with my husband. With each removal, I felt lighter. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I was finally severing myself from expectations that had choked me for years. And in that lightness, I found clarity. They didn't just leave me at the airport. They left me long before that. Every time they took without offering, every time they dismissed my grief, every time they made me feel like a guest inside the home I'd once built with love. This wasn't punishment, it was protection. Not from them, but from the version of myself that kept shrinking to fit inside their indifference. The next step was choosing who would inherit what Jake and I had worked for our entire lives. JR asked gently if I wanted to leave anything to the grandchildren. The question should have hurt more than it did. But the truth was, they were children being taught by adults who didn't value me. It wasn't their fault, but it wasn't my responsibility to fund a future where I had no place. I shook my head. No, not now, not like this. Instead, I asked JR to help me redirect everything. Our home, the land, the small investments Jake tended with such pride toward Elder Haven, a non-profit dedicated to helping seniors abandoned or manipulated by their own families. A place where people like me could find shelter, protection, dignity. The decision came from a deep place inside me, a place carved from years of caring for others without being cared for in return. Because when the people you love forget your worth, sometimes your legacy must go to those who still remember theirs. JR nodded with admiration hidden behind professionalism. He told me stories of people who had done similar things, quiet acts of defiance by mothers, fathers, grandparents who'd realized too late that love given without boundaries becomes an invitation to be used. But hearing about them didn't make me feel weak, it made me feel seen. I wasn't alone in this kind of heartbreak, and I wouldn't be the last. That truth steadied me even more. We moved on to emergency contacts. For decades, Mark's name had been listed first. Doctor visits, bank accounts, insurance papers, everything. Today, I erased him with a single stroke. I left the space blank. I would fill it later with someone who treated me like a person, not a wallet. Then came passwords, access permissions, account locks. JR explained each step with patience. Together, we turned my vulnerabilities into safeguards. I imagined Tanya's face when she eventually realized she could no longer dip into my accounts as family convenience. I imagined Mark's voice, confused, offended, indignant. When he learned the future he assumed would fall into his lap had been carefully rerouted away from him. For a moment, guilt flickered in me. But guilt is a ghost that appears when you try to reclaim space you were told you didn't deserve. I breathed deeply and let it fade. Boundaries don't make you cruel, they make you whole. When the time came to sign, JR slid the final document toward me. My hand hovered above the dotted line, shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of choosing myself over the people who once defined my entire world. I pressed the tip of the pen down, and as the ink flowed, something inside me unlocked. I wasn't rewriting a will. I was reclaiming the woman I had been before people mistook my kindness for silence, before they mistook my love for endless tolerance, before they mistook my grief for weakness. With one signature, I took back every piece of myself I had given away without realizing the cost. When it was over, JR gathered the papers with a solemn nod. "We'll finalize everything today," he said. "And Blake, you're doing the right thing." I believed him. For the first time, I truly believed it. I stood, thanked him, and left the office with my head high. The sun hit my face as I stepped outside, warm and bright, as if the universe itself acknowledged the shift inside me. My heart still ached, but now the ache had edges, not a shapeless fog, but something I could name and eventually heal. As I walked down the street, I realized something profound. My son had taken my luggage, my money, my dignity, or so he thought. But dignity cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered. And today, I refuse to surrender any longer. Because little did they know, while they walked onto a plane believing they'd left me powerless, I was signing the very papers that would change everything they were counting on. What do you take with you when you walk away from a place you once called home and realize it forgot you long before you ever left? I didn't return to the old house right away. I spent the night in a modest motel, one of those places with flickering hallway lights and thin curtains that barely keep out the sunrise. But lying on that stiff mattress with my hands folded over my chest, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peaceful. Not because everything was fixed, but because the worst was finally behind me. The betrayal had happened. The truth had been revealed. The wound was open, yes, but at least it wasn't festering in the dark anymore. Morning light crept through the curtains, painting the room gold, and for the first time since Jake died, I didn't wake up confused or broken. I woke up certain. Today, I would go back, not to reclaim what was mine, but to release it. Because sometimes the only way to save yourself is to leave behind everything that keeps you small. The drive back to the house took less than 2 hours, but emotionally it felt like crossing a lifetime. My fingers drummed on the door handle as the cab turned onto our street. A quiet lane lined with tired maple trees and mailboxes leaning at tired angles. Nothing dramatic, nothing remarkable. Just a neighborhood where people built stories and grew old inside them. As the house came into view, my stomach tightened, not with fear, but with memory. There it was, the place where Jake and I planted tomato vines that never quite thrived, the porch where we shared coffee every Sunday morning, the front door he painted blue because he said every home needs a color that feels like a greeting. But today, the blue looked faded. The shutters sagged. The wind chimes Jake hung sang a lonely, brittle tune. The house hadn't changed. I had. I stepped out of the cab and walked toward the door, feeling the weight of decades settle softly over my shoulders. I expected anger, maybe even grief, but what I felt instead was detachment. Like I was visiting a museum built out of someone else's memories. I reached under the planter by the stairs and pulled out the spare key, the same hiding spot we'd used since the year Mark lost his school key 3 times in 1 week. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stood in the doorway for a long moment. It smelled like lemon cleaner and stale air, a house kept tidy but not loved. Inside, everything looked exactly as it had before Jake died. His slippers still tucked under the nightstand. The books he half read still stacked beside the recliner. The framed photos on the hallway wall, birthdays, anniversaries, graduation days, still perfectly straight. Everything familiar yet empty. I walked through each room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of picture frames, the cool surfaces of countertops. These were things I once thought I could never leave. But grief has a way of rearranging priorities. And betrayal has a way of burning attachments from the root. The movers I hired from a neighboring county arrived shortly after. 3 kind men who didn't ask questions, didn't pry, didn't judge. I told them quietly, only a few items, and I meant it. I didn't want the dishes Jake and I bought on sale 20 years ago. I didn't want the heavy dining table that held decades of dinners and disagreements. I didn't want the mattress we replaced when Jake insisted I deserved better support for my back. Those things belonged to a life that had ended. What I wanted were pieces of my heart. So I chose carefully. Jake's favorite chair, the one molded perfectly to his back after years of reading. My mother's quilt, stitched by hand and frayed along the edges. Our wedding album, a little water-damaged from that night, the roof leaked, but still glowing with joy. A small box of letters Jake wrote during his Navy days, yellowed, soft, priceless. And a single framed photo of us dancing barefoot in the living room on our 25th anniversary, the record player spinning a slow song in the corner. I placed that photo gently into a tote bag myself. Isn't it strange how you can fit a lifetime of meaning into a few boxes while the rest of the house feels like a stranger's belongings? Once the movers loaded everything, I walked the house one last time, not to mourn it, but to thank it. This place sheltered me. It witnessed me. It held the laughter and the heartbreak. But it no longer held my future. In the kitchen, I placed a sealed envelope on the counter, my handwriting steady, my message simple: don't call, don't ask. I am exactly where I want to be. Left the house key beside it. When I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, the finality didn't sting, it soothed. It felt like closing the last chapter of a book I had read too slowly, too painfully, too loyally. The cab driver loaded my few boxes and asked kindly where we were headed next. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp Tennessee air fill my lungs, and I said the name of the place I had chosen days earlier. A place built on dignity, not obligation. A place Jake and I once toured quietly, just in case, and joked about joining if they served good pudding. A place where the door would open because I belonged, not because I was useful. Willow Grove. An independent living community with sunlit hallways, garden courtyards, watercolor classes, book circles, and people who looked at each other like equals, not burdens. When I arrived, the staff greeted me warmly, calling me Mrs. Monroe, holding the door like they were welcoming someone who mattered. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I did. The movers placed my chair by the window, set the boxes on the floor, and wished me well. When they left, I sat in the quiet of my new room, sunlight spilling over my lap. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning I should have chosen long ago. Because as I sat in that sunlit room, surrounded by only the pieces of my heart I chose to carry forward, I realized my old house was never my home. This place, this peace, this freedom was. What happens when the people who left you behind finally realize you're no longer waiting for them to come back? My mornings began with sunlight pouring through my window instead of dread. My afternoons filled with watercolor classes where I learned to paint things I once thought too delicate to recreate. The wings of a sparrow, the softness of a sunrise, the curve of a leaf. Evenings ended with laughter around the communal dining table, the kind of laughter that came from people who didn't want anything from me except my company. No tension, no guilt, no expectations. It was astonishing how differently a heart beats when it isn't bracing for disappointment. Peace is strange that way. You don't realize how starved you were for it until you finally taste it again. In those 6 months, I didn't once think of calling Mark. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because the version of me who once chased after him, apologizing for things I didn't do, shrinking myself to avoid conflict, offering love like a discount sale, didn't exist anymore. I had shed her like a skin that no longer fit. My days were my own, filled with people who said my name with warmth instead of weariness. People who asked how I slept, what book I was reading, whether I wanted to join them for a walk in the courtyard. It was like being reintroduced to a softer world, one where I wasn't measured by how useful I was, but by how human I was. And then one morning, circled discreetly on the calendar tucked inside my closet. The silence ended. JR emailed me first. A simple subject line, nothing dramatic, notices delivered. I stared at those 2 words. 6 months of quiet, 6 months of healing, 6 months of rebuilding myself brick by brick. And now the moment had come. The moment my son would discover the truth I hadn't spoken to him, the truth I had written with ink instead of emotion. I didn't tremble, I didn't hesitate. I simply closed the laptop and settled into my chair, the one that once belonged to Jake. It fit against my spine, just as it always had, steadying, supportive, familiar. And as I breathed in the faint scent of old fabric and memory, my phone began to ring. Once, then again, 16 times in a single day. The screen lit up with the same name every time, Mark. A name that once made my heart swell, a name that now made it go quiet. Funny how one decision, a pen stroke, a boundary, a choice to choose yourself can turn someone else's entitlement into panic. I didn't answer, not out of spite, but out of clarity. There was nothing left to say, because the moment they left me at that airport, they had already spoken their truth. These frantic calls, these unanswered rings, was simply the echo of consequences finally catching up to them. By afternoon, the calls became texts, then emails, then longer messages dripping with urgency but not accountability. Mom, can we talk? Please call me back. We need to straighten out this misunderstanding. Not once did he write, I'm sorry. Not once did he acknowledge what he'd done. The closest he came was, we didn't think you'd actually go through with it. And in that one sentence, everything became crystal clear. They had counted on my silence more than they ever counted on my love. That evening, the Willow Grove dining hall buzzed softly with conversation. Forks clinked against plates. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't that funny. Retirement didn't quiet people. It freed them. I sat at the table with Helen on my left, Ruth on my right. And while they ate and chatted about ordinary things, weather patterns, new neighbours, the rumour about Wednesday's pudding being chocolate instead of vanilla, I felt my phone vibrate again in my sweater pocket. I didn't check it. Not because I feared what it said, but because I no longer needed to know. Later, I sat in the sunroom with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the slow drift of dusk through the courtyard. I thought about the garden behind my old house, the one Tanya used to take photos of and brag about online, without ever thanking the person who taught her how to keep herbs alive. I thought about the land they assumed would be theirs someday, the savings they assumed they'd inherit, the life they assumed they could step into without offering anything back. Assumptions die hard, but they do die. The next morning, I finally opened one email, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted closure. I'm sorry, Mom, but can we at least talk about the house? There it was. No apology, no regret, no understanding. Only concern for what they'd lost. The house, the land, the money. The life they assumed was guaranteed. I closed the email without responding. Sometimes silence is the most honest answer you can give someone who only hears themselves. That afternoon, while returning a book to the small library, Ruth glanced up at me with a knowing smirk. "You look like a woman who finally told the world a truth it wasn't ready to hear." I smiled. "I think I did." She patted my hand. "Good. The world needed to hear it." I walked back to my room and looked at the framed photo of Jake on my bedside table. His smile, wide, genuine, all heart greeted me like it had for 42 years. And for the first time since he passed, I felt not grief, but gratitude. Gratitude that he had taught me how to stand. Gratitude that he had given me tools to survive a heartbreak he never lived long enough to see. Gratitude that he had loved me in a way that made me finally understand what love wasn't. Because when the phone stopped ringing and the world finally went quiet again, I realized something powerful. Losing them didn't break me. It freed me. What is the moment you stop whispering your pain is the moment you discover the kind of strength people spend their whole lives searching for. The days after the last phone call were strangely quiet, not the empty, aching quiet I used to feel in my old house, but a peaceful one, the kind that settles over your shoulders like a warm blanket. Willow Grove had its own rhythm. Mornings filled the hallways with the soft shuffle of slippers and the scent of toasted bread. Afternoons carried the sound of laughter from the craft room. Evenings brought gentle music drifting through the courtyard as residents gathered to talk about nothing and everything at once. It was a place where time didn't demand anything of you, where no one measured your worth by what you provided, where simply existing felt like enough. I used to think home was the place you lived the longest. Now I know home is the place where you no longer feel the need to apologize for taking up space. Each morning, I'd start my day with the book club, a group of people who debated plots with the seriousness of diplomats negotiating treaties. They listened when I spoke, truly listened, not because they needed something from me, but because they cared to know what I thought. How different that felt from the strained conversations I used to have with Mark, where every word felt like walking across thin ice, afraid of sinking into disappointment. At Willow Grove, I wasn't walking on ice. I was standing on solid ground. In the afternoons, I joined a gentle yoga class held in the courtyard. My balance wasn't perfect, far from it, but no one rolled their eyes, no one sighed impatiently, no one made me feel like a burden for trying. The instructor would say, "You're stronger than you think, Blake." And for the first time since Jake died, I believed someone when they said something kind to me. Sometimes all a person needs is one voice telling them they haven't faded into the wallpaper of the world. I rediscovered painting. I used to love it decades ago, before life demanded too much of me and left me too tired at night to pick up a brush. But here, surrounded by people who found joy in small things, I let myself try again. My hands weren't steady, and the colours bled into each other more than I intended, but each canvas felt like a quiet victory, a reminder that life didn't end when they walked away from me at that airport. In many ways, it began again. One evening, as I was cleaning up paintbrushes, a woman named Ruth, sharp-tongued, soft-hearted Ruth, looked at me with a question in her eyes. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. She didn't specify what it meant. She didn't have to. I rinsed a brush under the faucet, watching the water turn pale blue. "No," I said after a moment. "I regret not doing it sooner." She nodded like she already knew the answer. That night, I sat alone in my room with the window cracked open, letting in a soft breeze. On my bedside table sat a framed picture of Jake, the one where he laughed with his whole face. I lit a small candle beside it, not out of grief, but gratitude. "I'm okay," I whispered. The one I hadn't said out loud. They thought I'd fall apart. The breeze carried the words back to me softly. They thought abandonment would break me. I leaned closer to the photo, imagining Jake seated across from me the way he used to during our late-night talks. "But you know what, love? They're the ones who lost something that day, because the cruelest part of betrayal is not the moment someone leaves you, it's the moment they realize you never needed them to return. Mark and Tanya hadn't just abandoned me physically, they had abandoned the responsibility of presence long before that airport scene. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, my patience for permission, my love for a blank check. They believed I was someone who would always be waiting by the door, no matter how many times they walked past me without a glance. And maybe for years that had been true. But something happens when a woman reaches the edge of her heart and finds there's no more space for disappointment. She stops whispering, she stops bending, she stops handing out forgiveness like candy. She chooses herself, not out of selfishness, but out of survival. Peace is not found by holding on. Sometimes it is found only when you finally let go. I realized then that my story wasn't about loss. It was about reclamation. I hadn't just removed them from my will. I had removed myself from a life where my kindness was treated like currency. I had chosen new traditions, new names to sit beside, new memories to create. Not bound by blood, but by respect. Some nights I'd walk slowly through the courtyard, a soft golden light spilled from the community room. I'd listen to the hum of conversation drifting through the windows and think about the word legacy. People often believe legacies must be financial houses, land, accounts. But perhaps the greatest legacy is choosing the ending of your own story, even if you must tear up the old script to write a new one. In the end, I didn't lose a family. I simply stopped chasing the wrong one. At Willow Grove, they knew my name. They saved me a seat. They remembered how I liked my tea peppermint in the afternoon, chamomile at night. They saw me, the real me. Not the muted version I had become from years of emotional neglect. And when I blew out the candle beside Jake's photo, I smiled. Not because everything had healed perfectly, but because I had. I had walked away. I had spoken my truth. I had chosen my peace. So to every grandmother who still whispers her pain into the dark, listen to me. You are not invisible. You are not a burden. And the moment you choose yourself, the world will finally hear your story.